So the first thing you gotta do when you're making an a posteriori language is decide where and when that language will be used. Roughly speaking, there are two types of a posteriori conlangs: future languages and alternate history languages. The distinction is based on the location of what we'll call the point of differentiation, or POD. Basically, for every a posteriori language, there's a point at which the history of the language in the con world starts to differ from the history of its relatives in our world. If the POD is in the past, then it's an alternate history language. If the POD is now, this current moment, then it is a future language. In general, future languages are easier to create than alternate history languages, and we'll see why in the next video. Once you've decided if the POD is in the past or present, you then have to decide what exactly it is historically. For example, Paresi is an alternate history language. The POD is in 532 CE, during the Nika riots, a series of revolts in Constantinople against the Byzantines. In real history, the Empire Justinian stayed in the city, quelled the riots, and the Byzantine Empire lasted for centuries more. A legend goes that he was about to jump ship, but his wife Theodora counseled him to stay. In the alternative history, however, Theodora failed to convince Justinian. They fled to Thessaloniki, the Byzantine Empire fell early to the Seleucids, and a new empire was slowly formed from the former Byzantine provinces of the Levant and North Africa. And with that new empire arose a new lingua franca, a pidgin of African Vulgar Latin and Roman Egyptian, that would become Paresi, eventually. From that one POD arose the historical context for a language. You definitely don't have to be as specific as me with an exact date or year, but you have to know what your POD is. What is the difference that prompts the evolution of this new language? A simpler POD than mine, for example, would be if you wanted an Austronesian language spoken in Argentina. Just say Austronesian sailors made it farther than they did in real life. And there you have your POD. No more explanation needed. If it's a future language, then your POD is now, and you're just predicting what happens in the future. Once you have your POD down, then it's time to take your language from that POD to whenever you want your modern language to be spoken, the time of reconstruction, or TOR. Decide how many years since the POD have passed, and then you can fill in the history as basic or as detailed as you want of your language's region from the POD to the time of reconstruction. To use Paresi as an example again, for my POD, the Paresi Empire developed in the Levant and North Africa. Then it was conquered by Arabs, just as the Arabs were in real-world history, except that in this history the conquest came later and was less permanent, and a wave of revolts led to a second Paresi Empire, thriving at the time of reconstruction. So, cool, but why does this matter? World building is fun, but there is another reason we're doing this. This history is what helps our a posteriori language to be naturalistic, mimicking realism, and also it will just make things way easier later on. From this history, we're able to see what languages influenced our conlang, when, and in what capacity. Paresi developed from the Vulgar Latin spoken in Africa, with Neo-Punic vocabulary and some grammar added on. During the Byzantine period, Koine Greek was used as a lingua franca, and so many words of Greek origin relating to trade, transportation, and religion can be found in Paresi. Then, during the First Paresi Empire, a pidgin of Greek and Coptic, which had been the colloquial language of Alexandria during the Byzantine period, became the official language, and so Paresi was even more influenced by Greek, but also by Coptic. When the Arabs invaded, Arabic words relating to administration, religion, art, philosophy, and science made their way into the Paresi lexicon. And these influences aren't just important to the lexicon of your language, but to the phonology and grammar as well. Phonological and grammatical features can be loaned just as words can. We'll talk more about that in future videos. We wouldn't have known any of this without developing the history of the region. It could be that your language is spoken on a remote island and all you're doing is evolving from one other language, and that's fine too, and probably much easier. But if not, this is how you can make it naturalistic. So you want to decide when and what your POD is, and therefore if you're making an alternate history language or a future language. Then decide when the time of reconstruction is, and what the basic history of your region has been from the POD to the TOR. Finally, decide what language or languages your conlang will evolve from, and what other languages will influence it on its way. That's it for the historical context and world building, and I'll see you next time as we learn how to research our proto-languages. Grazie, arrivederci, thank you for watching, and see you soon.